Well, I want to welcome everyone here this evening. My name is John Eikenberry. I teach international relations at Princeton, and it's an honor to chair this session. I might start simply by noting that the topic for discussion tonight is an important one, the reform of the UN seen through the lens of the recent oil for food episode. UN reform is in many ways at least in the top of the debate of global affairs, although actual reform has been frustratingly slow. It's a remarkable historical moment in many ways. The UN is both simultaneously in crisis and in demand. Its structures, functions, management, from the management, the organization, all the way up to the Security Council, these functions are in need of rethinking, yet it remains the world's principal forum for addressing the most difficult international security and humanitarian issues of the day. Most recently, Lebanon, perhaps Sudan. Yesterday, I was in Washington for an event, and Senator Hagel stopped in to give a talk, and he said that today among his brethren, his politician colleagues, it's easy to vilify the UN, but whenever there's a crisis, every one of his colleagues scampers, as he said, to the UN looking for help. The Princeton Project on National Security, which we unveiled yesterday, Dean Slaughter and I did, offers a set of recommendations on UN reform. That will be for another evening's discussion, but it's certainly topic A. And tonight we have speakers who are going to address UN reform, again through the episode of the oil for food scandal. And indeed, it's a pleasure to welcome our speakers. Paul Volcker really needs no introduction to a Princeton audience. He's a graduate of Princeton. He served on the faculty here at the Woodrow Wilson School. He had a distinguished government career, culminating, of course, in his chairmanship of the Federal Reserve. And really, after that tenure in office, he had a whole nother career, still in progress, in an array of involvements in public service and international activities, leading groups such as the Trilateral Commission, the United Nations Association of the United States, advising groups such as the Institute for International Economics, the Japan Society, the American Council on Germany, and of course leading commissions and inquiries, including the one that we are going to talk about tonight, when on April of 2004, Paul Volcker was asked by UN Secretary General Kofi Annan to chair the independent inquiry into the UN oil for food program. There is really no one in the public sphere who I personally admire more. Paul Volcker really is the embodiment of this university's motto, Princeton in the nation's service and in the service of all nations. With him tonight, and we also want to welcome Jeffrey Meyer. Jeffrey has served as the senior counsel to the UN's independent inquiry. Before this, he was a U.S. assistant attorney in New Haven, specializing in environmental, financial, and civil rights crimes. He teaches at Quinnipiac College, law, and I would just finally note that these two speakers have written a book together, and we're going to hear about it tonight, Good Intentions Corrupted, the Oil for Food Scandal, and the Threat to the United Nations. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Paul. Welcome back to Princeton.
My more recent memory of Princeton when I was here teaching was John Eikenberry had an office alongside me. And he was a younger man then. I was no younger, but he was younger. And it's good to be back in his company as a leading professor at the school at this point. Let me just make a few introductory comments, and Jeff will run you through the investigation itself a little bit, but I want to do this as quickly as possible so that we can get some questions and a little discussion going. Let me just put a little plug for this book, first of all. We did this, actually it was Jeff's idea with one of his colleagues primarily. We said we had just spent 18 months in an investigation. We produced 2,200 pages of wonderful prose, carefully footnoted, carefully documented, in 5 volumes, a great mystery story, 2,200 pages coming out. The question was whether anybody would ever read it. And there's some interesting things. And we were a little frustrated at the lack of alacrity, to say the least, in the UN toward accepting the conclusions of the investigation. Well, they accepted the conclusions, they didn't accept the implications that the place really was in urgent need of reform. At least they haven't acted upon it. So we thought, they thought, and they involved me in doing this book, which is, you'll find, quite readable. But I would emphasize one aspect of this. We're here at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public Affairs. I was in Singapore a couple of weeks ago, partly because I am on the board of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Affairs in Singapore. And it's a relatively new school. It's doing, I think, a very good job, disciplined job, as you would expect in Singapore, getting their feet on the ground. But there was some discussion of the lack of case studies that are useful to students of public administration or public management, and indeed a lack of case studies that's useful to people interested in international affairs. And somebody had the bright idea, which was not me, but I'll pass it along to you, that this is an ideal case study of public management, mainly by default in the sense it tells you how not to do it, but a kind of very useful book, I think, for students of public administration that ought to be part of the syllabus of all management courses in Princeton and other schools of public affairs. Now, having said that, I was asked to lead this investigation, as John said, in the spring of 2004, and I hesitated and really didn't particularly want to get involved, but I kept getting urged to do it. And the most important thing I told the Secretary General, which I never let him forget, was if we do this investigation, it's going to take a long time, it's going to cost a lot of money. And it was going to cost tens of millions of dollars. And he was not quite prepared for either of those conclusions, but since he was on the spot and asked me to do it, he didn't have much choice, I guess, and he said, okay. But this is a substantial investigation that did, in fact, cost, I guess, $35 million by the time we got finished. Took about 18 months. We had 75 professionals of one sort or another, ex-prosecutors, ex-U.S. attorneys like Jeff Meyer, but equivalent colleagues from other countries. About half the staff was non-American, forensic accountants, very active and dedicated and talented staff. So we found out quite a lot. Surprised me. I'm not an expert investigator, but it amazes me what you can find out when you have access to telephone calls and emails and all that kinds of thing that Hewlett-Packard, illicitly or otherwise, has. And we found out a lot of things were wrong with this program from top to bottom. The difficulties began, I think, with poor decision-making and indecision in the Security Council itself. It was aggravated for sure by the lack of administrative discipline within the UN Secretariat. There was, for better or worse, obviously for worse, not necessarily too much, but there was some outright corruption within the Secretariat of the UN, and what really hurt was the man managing the program. Corruption may not have been very widespread, but the guy managing the program was himself corrupted. Unfortunately, and I guess remarkably, there wasn't that much money involved by Wall Street standards, but it was big money involved by his standards. There were 9 UN agencies involved, one way or another. World Health Organization, World Food Organization, UNICEF, UNDP. 9 different agencies involved in varying degrees, not well coordinated with each other. They had big responsibilities on the ground for allocating money in Iraq, not done nearly as effectively as it should have been. So up and down, there were problems. We reached certain conclusions, made some recommendations, quite lengthy recommendations. Those recommendations, almost without exception, paralleled recommendations other people have made who looked at the UN. What our value added is, or what our value added should have been anyway, or should be, is that we could document from this very extensive investigation and intensive investigation, we could document in a very concrete way the suspicions, the concerns that a lot of other people have had who have recommended reforms in the UN. Now, the really interesting question at this point, and the question that preoccupies me and my colleagues, and it's especially apt right now for 2 reasons. We're going to have a new Secretary General very shortly, and there are a lot of demands placed upon the UN. And the question is whether the UN is or will ever be up to the kind of demands placed upon it. Here we have the organization, for whatever else you say about it, pro and con, carries a certain legitimacy, or should carry a certain legitimacy in international affairs in dealing with the most acute of international problems. The question that's posed, I think, by this investigation and suspicions of many others is whether the organization is competent. And if the organization is administratively incompetent, can it sustain its real role in the world, and over time, can it really sustain its legitimacy? And I think that is the issue, the underlying issue that has to be dealt with or not dealt with one way or another in the relatively near-term future. It should have been dealt with already. The recommendations we made involve some fairly simple and straightforward things that in concept the Secretariat itself can put in force. They now have some ethics statement for the staff that they never had before. They have ethical standards put out. They have reporting requirements that are more adequate of outside financial interests, just as the United States government or many corporations would have. There are now, on paper, more clearly spelled out rules about conflict of interest of the staff, which did not exist before. And from people that look at this, have looked at these, tell me, on paper, this is kind of A+ now. This is standard of ex-Enron corporate business. So that much has been done. The question is whether it's going to be implemented with some kind of discipline. And one question arises when one of the recommendations of the Secretary General is a stronger auditing staff, a stronger internal inspection staff, certainly needed, provided for on paper. So far as I know, the staff is not in place. There's nothing much in motion to put the additional staff in place, and there's no money for it in the budget. So it raises the kind of questions that repeatedly arise in this organization. We concluded there are 2 basic changes that have to be made in this structure to be successful. One is just very straightforward that few people can contest. It needs some outside body responsible for oversight of the auditing function, the inspection function, the budgets of those functions, and the staffing of those functions to make sure they're professional. To act very much the way an auditing committee, an independent auditing committee of an American corporation ought to act and is instructed to act under present legislation. That has not effectively existed in the past. And the only disagreement about it intellectually that I've seen from the Secretary General or anybody else is, yes, that's a good idea, we recognize that. We'll set up an independent advisory oversight committee. And I say, terrific, you just have to take out one word, advisory. It should be an independent oversight committee, period. Proposal so far has been flatly rejected by the General Assembly that has the last say. The other one is a little more subtle and tricky point. It seems apparent when we looked at this that a Secretary General who was instructed by the Charter of the United Nations to have one duty, that's all it says, one sentence in the Charter. The Secretary General shall be Chief Administrative Officer. Well, in fact, the one thing that is quite clear over the years is that Secretary Generals are incompetent Chief Administrative Officers. Now, I don't say that as a great criticism of Secretary Generals. Their preoccupation is precisely what Kofi Annan is doing now. He's running around the Middle East, trying to make peace, trying to negotiate, trying to be a diplomat. He is the chief political officer. He's the chief diplomat of the UN, and that is a full-time job. And Kofi himself has finally admitted that. And part of this investigation, he says, well, I'm sorry, I didn't do a very good job, but I had other things to do. Well, that just is not good enough when you've got the weakness in administration. So our solution, if I can call it that word, our approach toward a solution is there has to be somebody on that staff that is indeed responsible for administration, is known to be responsible for administration, carries not only the title, but the authority that he needs to administer the place fairly and with discipline and efficiently. And to do that, he is going to have to be appointed just the way the Secretary General is appointed. He's going to have to be nominated by the Security Council. They recognize his authority and approved by the General Assembly, and he reports to the General Assembly. That has not been received with overwhelming acclaim by the Secretary General. Understandably, there's going to be room for tension between the two. I would only conclude what this organization needs is a little tension in order to get effective administration. But let me stop there, and Jeff can tell you more about the investigation itself, and then we'll leave a half an hour, hopefully, or so, or for some questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me here today. I studied at Yale, but I put on my Princeton orange for my visit today in hopes that my words might find at least a little bit greater acceptance. The program itself, as was our investigation, was really quite unique, and I want to, if I could, just go a little bit into the history for people who may not be entirely familiar with, well, what is this Oil for Food program, and why did we have it in the first place, and what did it achieve, and ultimately what did our investigation find? The sanctions against Iraq, of course, started in August of 1990, very quickly, very soon after the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam's forces, and continued even through March 1991, after the U.S. forces ejected the Iraqi forces from Kuwait, and ultimately continued all the way until March 2003, when U.S. forces, as we all know, returned. So it was just about the most long-running, certainly most comprehensive of sanctions schemes that the UN had ever imposed. Now, with this kind of sanctions scheme, which virtually, except for some humanitarian exceptions and limited ones, mostly in the form of donations, prohibited almost all forms of trade, prohibiting Iraq, of course, from even selling its oil, from importing goods, if it had the money in the first place from any sale of oil, into its economy. And of course, over the years, the Iraqi people's standard of living declined measurably. The UN, from the very outset in 1991, made various proposals to the Iraqi government to allow it to sell at least some of its oil in return for and use the proceeds in a kind of controlled way, I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment, to buy humanitarian goods. But Saddam resisted those efforts, resisted it for years and years. And it wasn't until the UN acted yet again in April of 1995 to authorize once again what became eventually the Oil for Food program. Iraq took another year before it agreed to the actual terms of the program, and the program didn't get going until the very end of 1996 and then ran up through 2003. More than $100 billion of total transactions that took place under the program if you count all of the oil sales and all of the humanitarian goods. So how would the program work in concept? Essentially, the idea was allow Iraq sell at first limited amounts of its oil, and ultimately, in later years of the program, Iraq could sell as much as it could produce. Take the money from the sales, rather than letting that money get back into the Iraqi government's hands, put that into a UN-controlled escrow account. And in fact, it was controlled under contract, by contract between the UN and the French bank, Banque de Paribas. Take that money and hold it in the escrow account and allow it only to be used for Iraq to buy certain humanitarian goods. And the range and scope of types of humanitarian goods expanded over the course of the program. But the whole idea here was, don't let Saddam have the money from the sale of oil. Don't let him control this kind of money, because the very purpose of having sanctions in place and continuing the overall sanctions regime, of course, was to deny him either access, of course, to the weapons of any kind of weapons of mass destruction in the first place, or military goods generally, or thirdly, any kind of currency and hard currency that could be used in foreign exchange markets, possibly to make purchases of prohibited goods of military value, or of course just simply to enrich himself and to build more palaces. So that was how the program, at least in theory, was designed to work. As we found in our investigation, it didn't quite work that way. Our investigation started almost by happenstance when it was really a combination of allegations, public allegations and reports came out about difficulties with respect to the program. After the U.S. invasion, the U.S. had access to Iraqi government records. And one of the things that they found, especially in the Ministry of Oil's records in Baghdad, were these odd allocation records that suggested that Iraq had been giving oil allocations to politically well-connected people. And most interestingly, from our perspective, in addition to various diplomats from mostly European countries and Russia, to the UN's chief administrator of the program, Under Secretary General Benon Savan. And an immediate question when this list was disclosed, I believe in January 2004, it first came to light when it was published in an Arabic newspaper, was, well, what is this list for real? Could it be true that this kind of secret oil allocations were taking place without the UN being aware of this? And the second issue that we started looking at had been an issue that had come to some public light a few years before, but was rekindled in light of the other questions that were being raised now about the program. And that was, there had been a particular contract under the program for the inspection of all the humanitarian goods that were coming in to the country. That contract had been let to a company that employed, a Swiss company named Cotecna Inspection, that employed the son of the Secretary General, Kojo Annan. And the question was this decision by the UN a proper one? And did the Secretary General himself act properly with respect to this procurement decision of what was ended up being a multi-million-dollar contract that was given to this Swiss border inspection company that was literally sending inspectors to the various border points at which goods under the program could go in and out. So that was kind of the broadest among other things, looking at the overall administration of the program and the accounts and the books and the records. But those are some of the broadest areas that we were trying to look at. Was the program run in some way corruptly, or was it maladministered or mismanaged in some way? And to go back to that point when Mr. Volcker had been asked by the Secretary General to take a look at this, this is very unique. The UN and most governmental bodies do not usually ask somebody on the outside to come in and look, right? In our federal government system, in our U.S. government system, and I've been doing that for more than 10 years as a federal prosecutor in New Haven, the prosecutors decide, they come in and they essentially do their own investigations. And it's a rare case, and usually an unpopular rare case, when you have something like an independent counsel. And effectively, the UN decided, and it was at the behest of the Secretary General, and ultimately with the endorsement of the Security Council, let's take an independent look at this. And so Mr. Volcker, Richard Goldstone, and Mark Peeth. Richard Goldstone, a former war crimes prosecutor and justice of the South African Supreme Court, and Mark Peeth, an internationally renowned law professor from Switzerland whose specialty is in corruption matters, formed this committee, this unique committee, to undertake an inquiry, and ended up hiring people like me, many of us former prosecutors and other accountants, to try to essentially put together very quickly a full-blown investigation of an institution that was not used to being investigated, right? Diplomatic immunity means something, right? UN officials, right from the Secretary General on down, are not at all comfortable with the notion of investigators and people like me coming in and asking uncomfortable questions about, well, how did you run this program and what happened here? And let me show you this document and explain this for me. So this was an odd situation for the UN, and it wasn't simply for the UN's personnel, because one of the things that we learned from the outset was this is not just a question of what the people at the UN in New York are doing. This is a question of what the members of the UN Security Council were doing. Well, why? Because the UN Security Council was the body that created not only the sanctions and authorized the sanctions in the first place, but it created the Oil for Food program. It wasn't as if Kofi Annan or his predecessor, Boutros Ghali, simply could create an Oil for Food program. It had to be something that was passed by the Security Council. Now, the Security Council had a decision to make. They could simply pass a resolution saying, there shall be an Oil for Food program, and this is what it basically shall look like, and then the UN Secretariat, you shall administer the program and report to us periodically how the program is doing. That's not a decision that the Security Council made in terms of delegating that kind of full-blown discretion to the UN's Secretariat, the international civil servants who work for the UN, and the UN's humanitarian agencies that were involved with monitoring and distributing some of the food goods in Iraq. Instead, the Security Council decided to delegate, but with many strings attached. And it took a very active operational role in terms of, certainly at the outset of the program, actually reviewing all of the humanitarian goods transactions that took place. That is literally any time a company wanted to sell Iraq some tires, right, or fertilizer, or wheat, the contract wouldn't simply go to a UN office. It would be circulated to the UN missions of all 15 members of the Security Council, and most significantly to the P5. That's the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, the US, the United Kingdom, Russia, China, and France, who were by far the most active in terms of overseeing how the program was run. And then these countries, through their diplomatic missions, actually had a veto authority over these contracts if they wanted to. And the similar kind of review process on the oil side. Instead of actually reviewing every single contract, the Security Council's Special Sanctions Committee, which was mostly lower-level diplomats from each of the member countries, would act and approve or disapprove, they had the power to disapprove, the oil prices. Right? So these are diplomats here involved in deciding what's the right price of oil for Iraq to sell to sell its oil at. So the Security Council retained this very close operational role, and the Security Council authorized the program not infinitum, but every 6 months. So at every 6-month juncture, it was in a position where it could turn around and say, hey, something's not working here. We need to change the way this is happening. So naturally, that led us in our investigation to say, we need to start talking to people of the Security Council. We need to start meeting with especially people from the permanent 5 members who were most active. Now, from the outset of the program, and one of the things that's most surprising, it's well known that Saddam ultimately was able to, in the Iraqi regime generally, was able to fleece or skim almost $2 billion from the program. And in fact, in particular, the raw numbers are, that we were able to calculate were on the humanitarian contract side. The Iraqi regime got kickbacks from the companies, from the more than 2,200 companies that participated, in an amount over $1.5 billion. And on the oil side, the Iraqi regime got illegal surcharge payments from these companies for more than $200 million, and leading all in all to nearly $1.8 billion of total kickbacks and surcharges that have been paid. That was the one thing that we were able to calculate. We also found at the same time that wholly outside the program, in terms of what the Iraqi regime was selling and buying under the program, the Iraqi regime was smuggling massive amounts of its oil. And this was an issue that was of most concern, or at least within most responsibility of the Security Council, because it wasn't the Security Council had the authority in terms of enforcement authority. As you know, the UN doesn't really have, it has peacekeeping forces, but does not have a sanctions enforcement police, right, that are out there. When the UN has sanctions, it counts on member states, and especially the member states with the most sophisticated law enforcement systems, to enforce its dictates. And we found, we're able to determine that just during the life of the program, during the years of the program, more than $8 billion of oil was smuggled outside of the program. So it's really dwarfing the amount of money, and these are all fairly large sums of nearly $2 billion that was skimmed within the program. So the question was, how do we get our arms around this and get around it really fast, because there's a real cry for action here, and this is affecting the UN's ongoing legitimacy, and different from what I had been comfortable with, and many of us had been comfortable with when we were working as prosecutors, is we had subpoena authority back then, right? We had a federal grand jury, very powerful institutions. They just drop a subpoena and say to a company, please produce all of these records, right? Or to a person, you, please show up next Tuesday and testify under oath before the grand jury. We didn't have that kind of power of compulsion. Again, we were in an internationally novel area of investigation. We had really a piece of paper, a Security Council resolution saying, we support the independent inquiry, we support Mr. Volcker, right? And you go out and investigate. And so the question was reaching out to these not only the companies that are involved, but the many countries that are involved, and securing and getting their cooperation. And, of course, reaching out to the UN. We ultimately did more than 1,200 interviews. Mostly, at least half of those people would be UN personnel. We collected more than 13 million documents, which we scanned electronically for electronic text searching. We went into the UN's offices and scrutinized it in a way certainly they had never been aware of, in terms of going right to the Secretary General's computer, for example, and imaging it, going through years and years of people's emails. To give you an example, we grilled the Secretary General 7 times. We grilled other UN officials many times. In terms of interviews, we were very aggressive in terms, and it was unprecedented in a way that we were trying to figure out what went wrong with this program, and could these initial allegations be substantiated? And so I guess maybe I'll just summarize a little bit what we found. I don't want to take up all the time in terms of questions, but with respect to the chief administrator of the program, we were able to corroborate, Benon Savan, we were able to corroborate that in fact these records from the Iraqi government that show that he had gotten oil allocations appeared to be true. We located a company based out of Switzerland, the company that had kind of been the front company that had traded on the contracts that had been assigned and designated as the company that would handle the contracts for Savan's oil allocations. We tracked down the man who ran that company. We got records from many different countries, financial records, and basically we were able to trace the money going through various Swiss bank accounts, and ultimately being taken in cash. Conveniently enough, at times when Savan himself was visiting in Geneva, Switzerland, and returning to New York, or when one of his persons was working with him, a resident of New York was in control of this particular bank account in Switzerland, and took this money and this cash money and deposited it to his bank accounts in New York. So we were able to corroborate and establish he'd gotten the allocations, and ultimately he had financially profited from that. We spent a lot of time looking at the UN's procurement department and the manner in which it gave out contracts, not just for the one that I talked about with the Secretary General's son, but the other contracts, the other major contracts that were given out under the program. And we found that political considerations intruded very strongly in terms of the way and were used to justify, often without saying, how contracts were given out, and oftentimes in violation of the UN's own procurement rules. And as Mr. Volcker mentioned, this has led to an overhaul of the UN's procurement department rules that's still ongoing in terms of one of the major issues of reform. It also led to a criminal indictment by federal prosecutors in New York of one of the chief procurement officers who was involved with that and who had a lot of money, shall we say, in offshore accounts that were unaccounted for and certainly should not have had. We looked as well, spent a huge amount of time looking at the companies and trying to understand all these companies that had paid these kickbacks. Essentially, and one of the surprises was, Saddam didn't start extracting kickbacks out of the program, as far as we could tell, right away when the program started in late 1996 and early 1997. It really wasn't until the latter half of 2000, and then from there through most of the rest of the program until early 2003, that Saddam and the Iraqi regime was getting kickbacks. And essentially, it was an official government policy. No kickback payment, no 10% essentially, no contract. And to our surprise, we found not only that various nameplate companies and companies that nobody had ever heard of were paying kickbacks, but we also identified kickbacks in relation to contracts with Volvo Construction Group, right? Siemens, one of the German company that's one of the world's largest electrical light manufacturers. Daimler Chrysler, small kickback, but still a kickback paid in connection with the Daimler Chrysler contract. And the single largest kickback payer under the program was a company from Australia. In fact, it was a company that sold more goods to Iraq than any other company under the program, the Australian Wheat Board. At one time, in fact, for the first half of the program, it was owned a statutory entity of the Australian government. And we found that more than $200 million of kickbacks had been paid as supposed, in disguise, as supposed transportation costs for inland trucking fees within Iraq that ultimately actually went to the Iraqi government. So we found this broad, vast range of corruption among companies, and we found that both the Security Council and the UN's internal offices, that the Secretariat were aware of these policies, of the kickback and surcharge policies. They had been, in fact, reported at times in the specialized trade press, the oil trade press, and even, in March of 2001, the New York Times ran an article talking about the prevalence of kickbacks and the fact that Iraq was demanding kickbacks. And we found and spent a lot of time trying to figure out, well, why didn't the Security Council do something about this? And we found the Security Council simply was paralyzed. Lack of consensus about what to do. In particular, countries, we found a strong correlation between countries that had companies with the most number of contracts. And those were Russia, China, and France. It got almost 50% of the oil contracts, for instance. And they were most resistant in the Sanctions Committee to instituting reforms to address the surcharges and kickbacks. And we also found that at the UN level, at the administrative level, not just the fact that the chief administrator was on the take from oil allocations, but that the problems were really not being given the attention right on up to that they needed to, right on up into the Secretary General's office. With respect to the one contract that, or the contract that I talked about before, that was given to the company that the Secretary General's son worked for, we found evidence that the son had made efforts to contact the procurement department, although he had disclaimed having done that. In fact, he had made efforts to contact the procurement department. He knew people who worked in the procurement department, and the company, which had disclaimed his involvement and claimed at the time that after it got the contract, it terminated his services and had nothing else to do with him, that company, that Swiss company, was secretly paying him every month through nominee bank accounts for his benefit. And that, in fact, continued right until 2004, right into the period of time when we are starting to do our investigation. We spent a lot of time looking and trying to figure out, well, did the Secretary General know about this? And we were unable to determine, first of all, that the Secretary General was aware that this specific contract was even being let. And you ask, well, how could that be so? Well, the Secretary General doesn't have authority under UN rules. He doesn't have an ordinary role in terms of checking a box or signing off on procurement contracts like this. We found no evidence in the millions of documents that we looked at that anybody ever sent a memo, an email, or something to the Secretary General saying, hey, your son's company is bidding on a contract, or much less even the name of this company that was bidding on this contract. We were unable to verify even that the Secretary General knew that this contract was being put up for bid. He insisted consistently with us that he did not know that this contract was being put up for bid, that he did not know that his son's company was putting a bid in on this contract. And so we were, ultimately, it was inconclusive in terms of what we were able to determine concerning the Secretary General's. I'm sorry?
You got enough evidence here. We've got to give them the
Right.
time.
So, I'm sorry to go on so long, but that's essentially the major findings of our. Thank you.
Well, we've got a lot of issues on the table here, and I want to just start off by asking, you've established wrongdoing in this program, and I guess my first question is, what has happened to your findings? You were asked to investigate, you investigated, you returned a report. What happened? Is it just on the shelf? Was there a response? And what kind of response, both at the level of and this is really a question about how the UN deals itself with these kind of transgressions. How do they deal with them? But secondly, what is the status of reform? Has anything happened to your recommendations? I know in July there were some administrative reform provisions enacted, international accounting standards, information technology updating. But so what has been the impact at the level of reform of your inquiry?
Well, I guess I would like to say the glass is half full, but in fact I think it's only quarter full. What's happened, importantly, as a result of the investigation, or the fact that the investigation was going on, as I indicated earlier, there have been quite a lot of internal effort to do what seems from today's perspective a fairly obvious thing, both for the UN and for American corporations, or for government generally, actually. And strengthening the ethical standards, the conflict of interest rules, financial reporting rules, whistleblower protection, the kind of thing you think should be characteristic of well-run organizations. Sparked a lot by a new American undersecretary in this area. So that has been done. The question is how effective that in itself will be given the record of undisciplined follow-up for anything. Characteristic of the UN, we found evidence that people in the purchasing department just didn't follow their own rules. They had reasonable purchasing rules, they just didn't follow them. And it's a violation of UN rules not to follow them. And initially the UN suspended the people we pointed to, and they went through some staff procedures and they got reinstated. Just on what grounds, I don't know, but it's not easy to deal with a staff person in the UN under current rules. What is disappointing is the more fundamental structural changes that we and others have proposed. And the way it's handled is the part that's disturbing. This is really, the administrative matters in the end are really the responsibility of the General Assembly. There are 192 members of the General Assembly, 192 member states, each with one single representative, single vote in the General Assembly. To put it in its crudest form, some of those countries are more important than others. In fact, I saw a list of some NGOs put out of dysfunctional countries. If you look at those lists of NGOs about dysfunctional countries, you have covered half the members of the UN. It's not a very inviting forum for effective administrative discussions. I don't know if it's as bad as U.S. Congress, but
I was going to ask you about that.
It's similar to, you ask the House of Representatives to be the governing body of the United States and oversee the bureaucracy. Would not be very easy. The dynamics of the place quite clearly, two things preoccupy the General Assembly. They don't want to delegate anything. And their most important exercise of authority is over the budget. And how do you manage a budget? Well, you delegate it to a committee. They delegate it to a committee. It happens to be a committee of the whole. It's got 192 members of the committee. And it operates by unanimity. Now, there's a budgetary procedure for it. But they are, institutionally, their reaction is, on almost any subject, it seems to me, from my limited view, you're encroaching on my prerogatives. And when these reform proposals were presented to the General Assembly, they would say, you don't have any authority to tell us how to reform, that's our business. Now, it's one thing telling me that. They tell the Secretary General that when he went to them with a series of reform, and that's what really triggered the final feeling of inaction that led to this book. Secretary General goes to him with the spring with a proposal including this oversight committee, and they in effect said, go home. And they haven't acted. I fear that, the typical small country doesn't see, he's one of 192 countries. It's very hard for him to see the big interest in the UN being reformed and to operate effectively. What he's interested in is whether the UNDP is providing aid to his country, or getting the Secretary General to appoint his deputy to some administrative job in the UN because he doesn't want to go home, which is typical. Very hard to run an organization that way. Somehow the General Assembly has to come to a realization that they can only be effective if they recognize they ultimately have the administrative responsibility and they're willing to organize themselves in a way that they can conduct that, which means, I think, adopting this oversight committee and say, you report to us and nobody else, which is the logic of the situation. That they get this independent administrator and say, you're our designate to run this thing. We're going to look to you to run the organization administratively, not policy-wise, administratively, and you're going to report to us, you're going to give us an annual report, you're going to propose the budget to us, we're going to hold you to administering the budget, so forth and so on. None of that exists. And it's just it's a difficult environment. We don't have the reform. Let me say, this all sounds critical. I want to make one disclaimer. I happen to be a believer in the importance of the UN. Because I think without the UN, as illustrated now, where do you go when there's a crisis? You're going to put sanctions on Iran? You're going to put peacekeeping forces in Lebanon? There are 19 or 20 peacekeeping forces in operation today. Most of them not very well administered. If this organization is going to do what we think it should do, what I think it should do, it needs to be reformed.
Let's open up. Please give us your name and affiliation and ask hopefully a quick question. We've got a short time, so we want to be able to have a few exchanges. Please.
My name's Jack Henneman. I'm an alumnus and a local. My question relates to transparency. You guys have, or had, I don't know where they lie right now, zillions of pages of machine-readable scanned documents. In a Western country, those documents would now be, at least as a formal matter, probably in the public record, having been introduced as pleadings or attachments in court procedures or evidence and so forth. They've not been, in my understanding, generally made available. What is the legal impediment to either making them available to the public or turning them over, for example, to the government of Iraq, which you would think would have the most skin in the game in terms of delving more deeply into some of the topics you investigated, since undoubtedly somewhere there remains under their jurisdiction people who had their fingers in the corruption from the Iraqi side. So what's the legal obstacle to turning over those documents rather than returning them solely to the United Nations?
Well, let me give you a quicker answer, and my lawyer may have a better answer. May have a longer answer, not a better answer. We've wrestled for hours and hours and hours as to what should be public and what should not be public. There are three basic problems. I think everybody recognizes when we've had interviews with people, and that kind of thing has to be held confidential unless the interviewee, in effect, has agreed to make it public, which was not conducive to getting much information out of them. So those kinds of things in any normal investigation you don't get. So far as they are UN documents, which is a major source of information, that ultimately has to be up to the UN. We don't own those documents. We had access to them, but we did not have the authority to release them. They obviously had the authority to release internal documents, and that has not yet been resolved. Our job is to turn them back to them. We know what the documents are, but to the extent they're going to be released, and I hope some of it is, it's up to them. There's a whole lot of stuff, particularly from Iraq, that has been released. Iraqis were very good at corrupting things, but particularly keeping meticulous records of their corruptions. So there were a lot of, the major source of information was Iraqi records, which we found generally to be accurate. I'll tell you one little side story there. We reported all the information we had as who paid kickbacks and who got surcharges and who didn't, who all the contractors. You know, 2000, well, 4,000 contractors and 2,000 says something about international business. Half the people who are contracting with Iraq in one way or another made illicit payments. Half of them. But there are a lot of names in that list, and we only investigated a few of the really obvious culprits, like the Australian Wheat Board. But about the day after we listed all this, there was an eruption in India. Because unbeknownst to us, one of the names on our list was the Foreign Minister of India. His name is Mr. Singh, and there are lots of Mr. Singhs in India. And this didn't exactly jump out at us, but it's true. He was the Foreign Minister of India. It became a major political scandal in India, still is. Major investigation. He has now been indicted, I think. He lost his job and has been indicted. And that investigation continues. It's a huge scandal in Australia because of the Wheat Board. But you find interesting things here in terms of, I'm not being very short, but it's interesting. The number of officials, quasi-officials, and
Paul, you've never been very short, but that's...
were involved. You had one interesting case, Ambassador Meyer of France, who was an ambassador to the UN. And he is up until the mid-90s, I guess, and he later became an advisor and I guess kind of honorary undersecretary to the UN. Mr. Merrimy's name appears on the list of being favored with oil contracts, which he's admitted.
Yes, and he's got money.
And he got money, and he's now admitted it. There are other French officials who have not admitted it, but there's a lot of smoke, which is probably... There are about 20 countries that are investigating. I don't know how many of them are going to produce... The United States government's got 1 or 2 people in jail. There was an attempt to outright bribe the Secretary General by Iraq, not Kofi Annan, but his predecessor, Boutros-Ghali, when the program was negotiated. One of those people are now in jail, and I guess his cohort will be in jail eventually. The Wheat Board in Australia, as I said, is a major scandal. And we'll see how many other countries take action. The biggest contractors for the program were the Russians, the most numerous ones anyway. We have seen no signs of any investigation by the Russian government. That doesn't particularly surprise us.
I don't need to add to that much, except just to say that if it were a federal grand jury investigation, the underlying records would not be made public. There's strict secrecy rules in the United States, even under our open economy, open political system, that investigative records are not made public. And we also have, this doesn't apply to all our records, but many of our records we got under very express confidentiality agreements between countries and between people who otherwise would not have given us access to that. We just couldn't disrespect that and give those records.
I have taken the public position when we started this, that we'll make as much of this public as possible. The question is how much is possible. You know. And the Iraqi stuff, by and large, is available.
Sir, please.
Mr. Volcker, I presume that you have some very large entity in mind that operates administratively very well, so that you compare the UN with that entity. Now, when I look at the UN peacekeeping, for example, in most places they have been successful, poorly administered or otherwise. Exceptions, maybe Lebanon, but in most other places they have been fairly successful. When you look at management of health in the US, you find that the administration of that as a large entity is not much better. You look at the management of pensions by General Motors or Ford or these large corporations, again you see the administration of those things is not much better. So what do you have in mind when you compare the administration of the UN as a poor administration?
In answering this question, I have to emphasize we were only investigating the oil for food program. But there is no doubt that many of the weaknesses we found in the oil for food program were systematic problems in the UN. The weakness of the auditing staff, to take one, A typical example of any organization, you need a reasonably strong auditing staff. In the early days of this program, they had one auditor on a program through which $110 billion passed. I mean, just by the end of the program, they had 3 auditors, I think, on the job. I mean, that is just administrative incompetence at best. It may be worse than incompetence because the manager of the program told the auditors he didn't want it audited. And they said, okay. Now that is a weakness, a grievous weakness in administration that I think exceeds even most American corporations, if I may say so. The inspection staff is very weak. Now in peacekeeping, which there's been a lot of problems in peacekeeping recently too, but the only study I know of peacekeeping, which we did not do, but the RAND Corporation did, and they're not great radicals, they try to do things carefully, came to a very nuanced, but the message is reasonably clear that peacekeeping operations, by and large, which the UN has been involved with, did better than peacekeeping operations where a national government, such as the United States, was the lead. And that's, that's the way it should be, because the UN brings a certain legitimacy. But that doesn't say it was great. The record was not great. And they've had more problems lately, I think, than they've had before. Now, even look at Lebanon. Big, major problem. The Security Council passed a resolution. The United Nations get in there with some peacekeepers. The next day, Kofi Annan says, well, it's going to take us 3 months. Well, I don't think that's Kofi's fault. But the fact is that's not a very effective, prompt response to a major problem. In this case, why not? They have no infrastructure. They do this repeatedly, but nobody trusts them enough to provide a budgetary or other resources that make it possible for the UN to respond quickly. Now, why not? Because they don't trust them. And I think you've got to get a good enough organization so that people trust it, so it can do its job. And that's what I guess this little campaign is all about. Now, so far as the United States government is concerned, I certainly was not investigating the U.S. government. But there are a lot of people that say we ought to have a good investigation of what happened in Iraq after the U.S. government took it over. A lot of money was spent in Iraq, and there are quite a lot of suspicions, but I didn't investigate it.
Can I jump in on that? This is the information I have on after the U.S. took over the Coalitional Provisional Authority after the invasion. $8.8 billion has been lost and unaccounted for under this U.S. and Coalition Authority auspices. Extraordinary amount, much more than the amount that was investigated by our authors here. Congress has shied away from investigating this larger problem, but to give you a sense of the magnitude, $2.4 billion in $100 bills weighing 28 tons was flown into Baghdad from the New York branch of the Federal Reserve in June 2004, the largest cash transfer ever made from the United States Fed, and a total of $12 billion in cash arrived in Iraq between March 03 and June 04. $8.8 billion was distributed without assurances from the Iraqi ministries of what the money was going to be spent on. No accounting has been made of that money. It's lost. I guess the question is, that's relevant to this. Where are the problems with that kind of funding? That's not really a UN problem. It's a deep.
That is not a UN problem, but.
And you did not investigate that after the authority shifted.
I don't think we can excuse what we did find in the UN. We're just saying other people do it. The problem is how to deal with it within the UN too. But let me say, what we did find in the UN, as Mr. Meyer said, the biggest source of funds to Saddam during this period was smuggling, which arguably was not in the oil for food program. It was smuggled outside the oil for food program. But why did they know about it and why didn't they do about it? Now, you may have your own ideas about the competence of the CIA, and National Security Agency and all the rest. But I don't think that oil was being trucked into Jordan and trucked into Turkey or sent in the later days to a not friendly country of Syria through a pipeline without the United States knowing about it. And in fact, there were reports to the Security Council, and I don't think the Secretariat was entirely oblivious. But why did not the Security Council take any action for flagrant violations of its own sanctions? You answer that one. That's the United States. That's France. That's UK. That's Russia. That's China. Maybe that's why no action was taken. But that is a real problem in the UN.
Sir.
I guess my question is...
Just say your name.
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Ron Zink, and my question revolves, what happens if they don't follow these, your recommendations? What happens if you say 25% roughly are followed, 25% of the glass is full? What happens if we don't make any more progress? And we stay we stay where we are. What's our alternative, and what do we do?
Well, you know, I mean, I think it's very sad, but a concern, which you'll see reflected in this book, my concern is that lack of action will bring lack of respect. And lack of respect brings problems of legitimacy and usefulness. And it's eroded away. Now, you know, we're on large problems of reform, which may be beyond all of us. We're talking about administrative reform. But take the problem which must have existed in the Security Council about what to do about this smuggling. Why was it shoved under the table, which is literally what was done? Because, one argument anyway, there was too much disagreement in the Security Council doing anything about it. You've got 5 countries. They each have a veto power. The others are more or less bystanders when it comes to issues of this sort. If you can't get agreement among the 5, the organization is impotent on that particular issue anyway. Now that's true whether it's an administrative problem, a money problem, or anything else. You see it in Darfur or every place else. Now how do you cure that? That's beyond my mandate.
Okay. The gentleman next to you, if you still have a question, and then we'll swing over here.
Yes, my name is Matthew Held. I'm a resident. I have I think, perhaps 3-part question. Mr. Chairman, this may take you back to your banking career, but I'm curious to know the privacy of the Swiss banking industry is sort of legendary and the cornerstone of personal private banking around the world. I'm wondering if that is not sort of a contributor or if the banking industry in Switzerland is not complicit in facilitating a whole range of illicit activities on the one part. The second part is, did you receive adequate transparency in your investigation from the Swiss banking authorities to enable you to chase the money trail? And finally, are you sure that you chased the money trail to the sort of bitter end, and or did those end recipients trickle that money sort of back up to higher up parties in their far-off positions?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. You know, my third committee member, one of my committee members, is Professor Mark Peake, who I'd never heard of. And I was, you know, when I was asked to do this, so who are the other members? And they said, well, we have a couple of other people who have been recommended to us. You tell us whether they're acceptable to you. So Goldstone I knew about, or quickly learned about, and there was no problem there. And there was this guy, Mark Peake. I said, who was he? And he says, well, he's a Swiss professor. He's a great expert in money laundering. I said, which side is he on? Which was a natural question. It turned out that he indeed is an activist in OECD in particular in developing anti-London money laundering measures. He's very well known around the world in that field. But beyond that, much to my further surprise, we got as much or more cooperation from the Swiss authorities than from anybody else. The kind of money transactions that Jeff referred to with Bernard Savon were all made possible by the cooperation of the Swiss authorities. And it didn't stop there. Now, they have laws and regulations, and you have to go through them. But I honestly think they did their best to expedite our requests. And in a large majority of the cases, and this is fair to say, they were able to help us. Now, why? This isn't what you normally thought of Switzerland historically, as your questions suggested. I think two things are going on here. One is they're a relatively new member of the United Nations, and they wanted to show their response to the Security Council demand for cooperation. And secondly, I think they want to change their image. Because I actually asked them, I said, look, you've been very helpful. I could ask this question, shall I say that you've been helpful? Or would you rather have me keep that quiet? And they assured me they were happy and delighted for me to be able to say that they had helped in this area.
Sir.
Len Gustafsson. My question is, what you have investigated and found seems it's carried on the same corruption, or similar corruption at this point in Iraq, and probably also in other parts of the world, including the US. Isn't it so that what you have found is much business as usual, and that you are projecting UN into this as a savior of the cause, and perhaps having a higher ethics than can be justified compared to how business is done?
Well, let me make one other response to that question. I think we ought to be a little bit careful about using the word corruption and what it involves. We found some corruption in the UN, and they're going to find some more corruption, I think, in the purchasing department as they investigate it. But I am not arguing that UN is pervaded with corruption at all, in the sense of people making money. The big corruption in this program was by the companies in Iraq, just in monetary terms, or in numbers of people involved. But I think corruption is a big problem in the world. I just was at these World Bank meetings and happened to be in Singapore at the same time and got involved in some of those discussions about corruption. And I think it is generally felt, fashions change, but by development experts, that corruption in some countries is a major obstacle to economic development. And in many countries, it's a very important obstacle to economic development. And the question is what you do about it. Very difficult. The UN is, the World Bank is trying to take more aggressive measures. And it's amazing how much pushback they get to their efforts to deal with corruption. And I do feel rather strongly that if you are the UN, or if you're the World Bank itself, or you're the IMF, and if corruption is a major problem, it's a major problem if you have it yourself. And you have a responsibility to try to deal with it, or you're not on very good grounds in dealing with it where it's really big. I think the UN's difficulty is not so directly overt corruption in the staff. It's a vaguer thing. It's what I call the culture of inaction. Nobody wants to take responsibility. In this case, the Secretariat would say it's the Security Council fault. And the Security Council said, well, the Secretariat ought to have done something. And the Secretary General said, well, my deputy should have done something. And his deputy says, I didn't know I was supposed to do something. And, you know, it's a very interesting story that you can read about here for $16.
And the book will be available outside for those of you.
Read about it for $16, but I want to assure you that the authors are getting nothing out of this.
Way up in the back, please.
So you say that one way to increase transparency in the UN is to have an independent administrative body. How different would that be to the UN Secretariat?
An independent what?
Independent body? That's what I understood.
Your first recommendation.
Yeah, an independent oversight body, yes.
How would that be different from the current OIOS?
Well, OIOS would be under, in effect. The oversight body would be overseeing the inspection service, so overseeing the auditing service, and maybe overseeing the ones of the independent agencies as well. Some of them are independent, some of them are not. Or other investigatory bodies in the UN and make recommendations if they are not adequate. Is the auditing department big enough? Is it following appropriate guidelines for its investigation? Is the staff pass some reasonable test of professionalism? And report to the General Assembly if they don't like it or they have something to say. That is essentially lacking now, and it shows. It's interesting that, I criticize, the report criticizes the auditing department and the inspection department. Didn't even exist in the UN a few years earlier. This is a new thing. The whole idea of being audited was, foreign territory to the UN until recently.
Sir. Just hold on 1 second, unless you have... We're giving you a workout tonight.
No, we're running overtime here. This is great.
I'm Seth Blumberg. I'm a student here. I have two sort of broad, long-term questions about the UN, in your opinion. One is Kofi Annan's successor. I'm wondering if you have high hopes that maybe the next Secretary General will do a better job in trying to get some of these reforms you suggested passed. And I guess that goes for other reforms in the UN as well. And my other question is, do you think that there will be less willingness among nations to pursue sanctions as a diplomatic tool, since sanctions lead to humanitarian problems, which so far seem to have led to incompetence and not worked out properly?
Well, will the next Secretary General do a better job? I'll tell you, I got a little concern. My friends of mine who very sympathetic to the UN, and without quite putting it this way, kind of suggest to me I'm not being very helpful to the UN. I think I'm being helpful to the UN. That may be my warped mind. We're getting a new Secretary General. New York Times they asked the candidates, what do you think is important to do in UN if you're made Secretary General? There were, I think, 5 of them responded. 4 of them did not mention administrative reform. 1 of them did. I'm sure he will get the fewest votes. He probably got them. It's already been, I guess, hasn't it?
Yeah.
And I suspect he got the fewest votes. Now I'm told the Korean who was supposed to get the most votes. Did you see the results?
I didn't see the results, no.
I'm told, but I don't know, he didn't report in the time, he didn't have any comments. He's very aware of this issue and very concerned about it. I hope so.
Can I just follow up on that? What is the most functional U.S. position to pressure reform? Is it to kind of high brinkmanship, kind of, we will withhold dues, we will sort of hold out a kind of very...
There was a confrontation on this shortly after our report came out, and happened to coincide with the budgetary cycle, which is a very slow cycle in the UN. And the United States, with quite a few allies of the major countries, I don't remember them all exactly, but these are countries, European countries, Canada, Australia, so forth and so on, got together to try to push some of these reform measures. And they had a list of them, and they finally forced a decision they lost on saying we're only going to provide a budget for this year. It's a biennial budget, or for 6 months. They lost, and they finally gave up, if that's the right word, is it? All right, but they got a provision that said after 6 months, we're going to review the budget, and if there's not sufficient progress on reform, we're going to stop paying. That's not just the United States. This is a group of countries. Well, the 6 months came. That's about the time that Kofi presented his reform proposals. The General Assembly told him to go home, and nothing was done. And push came to shove, they have continued to finance it. Now, the United States still tries to, there's kind of mixed signals, but at times Mr. Bolton says the United States is going to stop contributing if you don't do these reforms by the end of the year. And I guess our Secretary of State has not suggested that at this point. But, and I think unilateral cutting off the thing just aggravates people, gets their backs up, cripples the organization, but it's not very productive. But if you have these 20 or 30 countries that were concerned, which together provide the overwhelming share of the financing of the UN, as I say in my little introduction to this book, that sooner or later, it's probably sooner, it happens, you know, without anybody necessarily announcing, you don't get adequately financed. Because these countries, including the United States, aren't very happy to go to their legislatures and say, let's put up X amount for an organization which is not responsive to reform. Now, or they will block the next budget, which they can certainly do. If not block the budget, I mean, force it down and say, we'll force you to get rid of some of these programs. We'll force you to do this by making your budget skinnier than otherwise should be. It seems to me that's almost inevitable. The other side of that ought to be good news. If they have some sense of reform and greater confidence in the organization, they will finance it. And they'll finance it more liberally, I think. And I go back to my peacekeeping example. Why don't they have a better infrastructure for peacekeeping? Well, partly because they don't have the financing. For me.
One more question, and then we're going to wrap up. Please.
James Kellinger. Woodrow Wilson's original vision was for a League of Nations that was a forum for governments, but somehow the United Nations has evolved into a body that's exercising coercive power. It's actually seizing private property from governments. And at the same time, the United Nations members, as you said, are diplomats and are outside of accountability. Is the United Nations a good idea from the standpoint of history? If you look at history, the thumbnail sketches that you go from ruling families in Europe, there's the rise of the state, which are Republican governments, and now we've created a meta government which is outside of the accountability of people.
Big question for the end.
Well, I don't know what being outside the accountability of people means in this case, because we're not quite ready for the other extreme of a world government that's somehow kind of directly accountable to the citizens of the world, and the United States would be the first country to oppose that. The other extreme is not having the United Nations and doing everything ad hoc. I'm not sure. I mean, there's sure to be occasion when we have to cooperate with other countries, whatever this administration thought when they came into office. I mean, they have now changed their mind on that for sure. Given that fact, is the United Nations an efficient organization? No. Is it the proper organization for trying to get the best consensus possible out of a coalition of countries, or do you do it one by one? Well, I guess I'm not quite ready to give up on the United Nations, to say the least, but how can we make it better? Because I don't see how it's going to work more effectively without any framework at all. And, you know, it's amazing in areas that are not so politically charged how much we rely upon the United Nations these days. When you have an avian flu epidemic or outbreak, where do you go? You go to the United Nations to try to get enforcement or quarantines or whatever. You have a tsunami to get some coordinated assistance, where do you go? You go to the United Nations, and they actually did a pretty good job on that initially, I think. And, you know, the United States and others provided the money, but they had a coordinating mechanism for getting different countries to come together. Where do you go with an enormously difficult problem of displaced persons and refugees? Millions of them these years. To the extent they're taken care of at all, and I think this is one area where the United Nations has really been pretty effective. Wonderful leadership in the past 10 years has been in the refugee area. So there are a lot of things they do that somehow or another we have to replace. And the question is, can we do sanctions again? Is that? I don't know. I mean, I think it's very difficult from this experience to do sanctions without some assurance that the Security Council is fully behind it and is going to stick with it. And you can read the ominous signs that I read, but that doesn't happen to be very clear that that's going to be the case at the moment. But that's hardly the UN's fault. That's you can't have sanctions against Iran without involving China and Russia and France and all the rest.
Well, on that cautious note, would you join me in thanking our speakers tonight? Thank you very much. Yeah.